And like what happens when you cut into it?
It's immediately actually set a perfect barrier there.
Okay, so I think we can start. Welcome, everybody. My name is Matias Ornengo. I'm the director of the Bucknell Institute for Public Policy. We are very lucky today. On a personal level, I'm also very happy to have George McCarthy here. He's the director of the Lincoln Institute for Land Policy, right? And George, 30 years ago, yeah, 96. I started working in 96. 30 years ago, we worked together at the Levy Institute at Bard College. When I was a graduate student, you were an assistant professor.
Yeah.
He was an assistant professor, so that was long ago. So we worked with Vin Godley, as he was saying here. He was part of the team that actually did predict way ahead of it the bubble and the financial crisis. Then he went on to do work on housing, which is what he's going to talk about at the Ford Foundation, and eventually had his own sort of foundation and institute. He's going to, I should say also that he was Professor Schneider's, partner in graduate school. Yes, and they have the same. They share the same supervisor. Am I right? It's Sandy Darity.
That's correct.
Who makes him my? You are my nephew. So Lance Taylor was my supervisor. Was his supervisor's supervisor. So that's how it's all inbreeding in academia. So at any rate, he has many connections to our department. We're very happy to have him here to talk about housing poverty. It reminds me of Galbraith's sort of notion of private affluence in the midst of public squalor, and that's exactly what we're talking about, and the issues that are face the country. So thank you.
Yeah, thanks. So thanks. Can you hear me okay? Do I need this? Or do they need this on?
No, they don't.
Okay.
They'll pick it up.
And if just raise your hand if you can't hear me. I'll use the microphone, but I usually don't have any problem projecting. So so I'm the president of the Lincoln Institute of Land Policy, and if you don't know, the Lincoln Institute of Land Policy, we're a private operating foundation. We've been in existence now almost 80 years. That was from our 75th anniversary, and basically our modus operandi is we try to find ways to use land to address larger kind of existential issues that afflict the planet, like the climate crisis or a housing crisis, or trying to protect habitat for endangered species. We do all that kind of stuff. And so when people ask us, or they ask me, what is land policy, I give them kind of the quick answer is land policy is the rules of the game that define the relationship between people and place. And it's interesting, kind of I don't know if you're all economists or political economists, but one of the things about land is, of course, we're not making a lot of it. And so the normal rules of economics don't really apply to goods that are actually in fixed supply, which means that you really actually need to regulate that market, right? In spite of the fact that there's lots of economists who don't believe that you do, but so that's our gig anyway. And so I'm going to talk to just about kind of ways to think about what we can do about the housing crisis. I'm going to throw a lot of stuff at you, and what I do encourage you to do is to interrupt me, because I don't mind that, and I want to make this as interactive as I can, because otherwise I'll just bore you to death. So that's my goal. If it gets really boring, interrupt me, right? So one of the things that I want to kind of start this in kind of a theoretical frame, and what's funny is I give a talk like this. I've been doing talks like this for the last 2 years all over the place, and I usually do a poll of the room to find out how many people have read these 3 books, right? And in the course of, let's say, maybe 1,500 people that I've talked to over the last year, I've met 3 people who have read all 3 of those books. Now I know somebody else, and but here maybe more, right? So how many people have read Progress of Poverty, The Theory of the Leisure Class, and The Great Transformation, right? So there you go. We've more than doubled the number of people that I've met that have read all 3. And the reason that I bring these up is that in many ways, these are kind of theorists who are kind of prescient in terms of helping us to understand something that lots of us already knew, that the market economy doesn't actually work. And in particular, since I've been working in housing for a long time, the housing market really just doesn't function in the United States. And it isn't just homelessness that is, a problem, but it's the fact that like today, whether you know it or not, more than half of renters in the United States pay more than a third of their pre-tax income for housing, which is considered to be unsustainable housing burden. That's more than half of renters. And then there's another, I don't know, 15-20% of homeowners who are in the same boat, which just means that what we're doing is we're saddling people with unsustainable debt or unsustainable housing costs, and we make their quality of life worse, and we make their kind of the conditions they live in more and more uncertain, right? So, and as you might or might not know, so Henry George, who is actually kind of the intellectual kind of forebear of the Lincoln Institute of Land Policy, Henry George was called himself an economist. He really wasn't. He was more like a barnstorming kind of intellectual, but he was a son of a preacher, and he was trying to understand, he was trying to reconcile two things at the end of the Industrial Revolution, or in the middle of the Industrial Revolution, which was, why was it that we're creating all this incredible amounts of wealth and poverty that's so persistent, in particular urban poverty? And so George concluded that poverty persisted because we were giving away the benefits of economic growth to the wrong people, primarily idle landowners. And then that we were taxing the productive members of society, namely labor and capital, to run the public sector. And we were allowing this kind of inequality to flourish because inequality was all based on all the unearned benefits of land value going to landowners. And the primary concern there is that the value of land has almost nothing to do with anything the landowner does. It's created, it's a social creation, right? It's created by people wanting to live in a place. It's created by the public sector investing in infrastructure, making land more developable, right? The landowner, more often than not, just sits on the land, and then the value of the land goes up as a result of population growth or anything else. And then they get to enjoy the benefits of all that extraordinary wealth. And if you don't think it's extraordinary, just the housing finance system in the United States is about a $15 trillion market, right? So that's a lot of money in my book, right? And then Thorsten Veblen, we're just talking about it in Jeff's class. And so the Thorsten Veblen, of course, he talks about why it is that the way we consume goods sometimes is really, really counterproductive, right? And one of the big things, he coined this term of conspicuous consumption. And conspicuous consumption in the housing market is basically the culprit for why we build stuff we don't really need, right? And the easiest way to understand that is that in the US, the average size of a house in the last 50 years has gone up from about 1,600 square feet. This is an owner-occupied house, to almost 2,800 square feet. And the average family size has gotten smaller. So, and the thing about conspicuous consumption is, of course, it's status signaling, right? So you by the kind of house you own signals to people kind of what your level of success. And we've actually defined the American dream, right, as the ability to buy a home, build wealth through that home, and then transfer it across generations, right? And that's been really one of the outgrowths of the Great Depression that actually helped to draw the United States out of the Depression, right? It also helped to embed, structural racism into our housing finance system, which we're still trying to deal with since then. And then Karl Polanyi, the Great Transformation. I think Karl Polanyi was also just trying to understand kind of the rise of the corporate state, and trying to understand why it is that we allow goods to be kind of traded, and goods to be consumed, and goods to be kind of offered in the marketplace that aren't really produced for production. And in particular, he called these fictitious commodities. But he talked about land, labor, and money, right, as fictitious commodities. I just love housing because housing is mostly land, right? And in fact, if you think about housing, the value of housing and the appreciation of housing is 80% of it's in the land. It's not in the buildings. In fact, the buildings themselves, unless you invest in them continually, will actually amortize over time, or they'll fall down. So, all right, let's see. There we go. So I just told you what George said, so I don't need to tell you all this, except that one of the things that his remedy to the problem with inequality was just to tax away all the unearned benefits of land, all unearned value of land from landowners, and use it to fund the public sector and to eradicate poverty. And he wrote this in a book called Progress and Poverty that was, as it turns out, fun fact, it was the second most widely published book in the world in the 19th century after the Bible. It was translated to 33 languages and it was distributed all over the world. And it was just this theory and it created this whole kind of religious, movement of people who wanted to use the single tax as their answer to everything, right? And there's still a bunch of wackos around.
Barely lost the mayorship of New York. He was almost the Mamdani of his time.
He's almost the mayor of New York, and he actually ran for governor too. Didn't win that either. So, but anyway, the key to George and the thing that he found most reprehensible is how speculation in land can drive boom and bust cycles, and once again, enrich people who don't deserve it. Right? So in Veblen, of course, housing is a status of wealth game. Right now, the primary vehicle for displaying, or one of the primary vehicles for displaying social rank. In Jeff's class, we also talked about purses as being a status symbol as well, right? But the other thing is, what I call emulative consumption, but you guys called it emulative pecuniarity or something, right? That's even harder to say. So the idea is that the working class and the poor try to consume like the wealthy to try to also display that kind of status, right? And in order to do that, of course, they saddle themselves with extraordinary debt. And then what they have is unsustainable housing burdens over time, and they make their lives even that much more precarious, right? And then Polanyi, I guess I'd put it this way, right? The housing market dysfunction is really kind of inherent to the consequence of treating land as a commodity, land and housing as a commodity, right? And that's going to be kind of the focus of what I'm going to do for most of the rest of the talk, is talk about what are the implications of us commodifying everything, and in particular commodifying housing. Because when you commodify goods and you treat them as if they're tradable commodities in global capital markets, bad things happen, right? In general, right? And one of the things that you'll find in the contest for any good, when families come up against global capital usually wins, right? So it's just kind of the way it works, right? So, but anyway, so the idea, of course, is that when we allow housing to be treated as an investment good and as shelter, right? It's actually two goods that are being traded in one market, or it's one good being traded in two markets, depending how you look at it, because different fundamentals drive the investment market than drive the shelter market. But what any good kind of mathematical economist will tell you is one price cannot simultaneously clear two markets. So, and what it does is it makes the market dynamically unstable, right? And so if you allow capital flow into the market, you're going to create artificial shortages, right? And if capital runs away from the market, what you're going to create is housing gluts and falling housing prices in places like Detroit, right? And what the odd thing is, and this is one of those things about kind of, there's another guy I should have talked about, Amartya Sen. Amartya Sen studied famines, right, in the 20th century. And he showed that every famine in the 20th century was not the result of a shortage of food. And he documented it. Every single famine, millions of people dying of starvation in places in which food was actually not in short supply, right? And he called that entitlement failure, where something happened to the price of food and it ended up being out of reach of people because they didn't have enough money to buy the food. And so, and what he said was, there are human decisions that are made to allocate these goods, food in this case, or housing, where there might be enough to go around, but people don't have a big enough entitlement to command that product, right? So whether it's rice in India during the Great Bengal famine, or whether it's or rice in Bangladesh in 1974, or it's rice in Indonesia during the Asian currency crisis in the 1990s. It's all the same thing. There was plenty of rice, just people didn't have the money to buy it, right? In this case, in the United States, we have any given day anywhere between 250,000 and 750,000 unhoused families sleeping in their cars in the streets and shelters, right? And And yet we have way more housing than we actually need, right? So today in the United States, we have 145 million housing units. These are houses or apartments or condos or mobile homes, right? And we only have 131 million households. So we have 10% more housing than we need. And yet we have lots of people going without housing and lots of people with inadequate housing, right? And of course, this is not just, true in some markets, it's not just true in the markets where people have second homes because they want to have that lake house, right? It's true everywhere, right? And so these are real numbers, right? But you see, like right across the different census regions, anywhere from 5% in the West, which is a relatively tight market, to 16, 17% in the Northeast. We have way more housing than we need, and a lot of it is just vacant. And what's even really creepier is that as you ascend the price gradient in the housing market, vacancy rates go up. And that's the answer to why, if you go past, 432 Park Ave, one of those pencil thin skyscrapers in New York, at nighttime, you'll see 2 lights on in the whole building, right? Or 157 on Billionaires Row, you'll see, 3 lights on in a building that's one of the tallest residential buildings in the world. Or if you go to Brickell Ave in Miami, and you walk down Brickell Ave at any given night, you'll see that fewer than 10% of the condos are lighted, because people buy those things and they just speculate on them, and they voluntarily leave them vacant because they're just going to appreciate in price, and they're going to live off the speculation, or they're going to launder ill-gotten gains through the housing system by buying stuff and then using with their drug money or something else, or Russian oligarchs buying these things to sit on them because they're relatively stable resources to put your money into, and why not, right? So because housing is too good sold in 2 markets and one price can't clear them, or you have these crazy kinds of ratcheting effects of the housing markets either being super tight and unable to provide shelter for people, or you have these housing markets like when I was working in Detroit in the about 10 or 15 years ago, you had 100,000 vacant housing units because people just left, right? But in the fundamentals in the shelter market is, of course, like income, right? People's income are going to dictate whether or not they can afford to buy a house, right? The demographics, what kind of housing they need, interest rates, the local labor market. If people are unemployed, they're going to have a hard time committing shelter, right? But the market fundamentals for investment are interest rates and the price to rent ratios and expectations of price increases, and some demographics, right? Movement of people, right? But the thing about investment is all it does is it increases the amplitude of the swings in the market. When the market goes down, the investors leave, they go down further. When the market starts to come up, the investors show up and the prices go up further, right? So the housing crisis is a direct result of all these weird things, right? Of Polanyi and of Veblen and of Henry George. And we, for one reason or another, choose to let it behave as if it should be an unregulated market by and large, right? Because the Washington consensus that we've all been living with for the last 40 years tells us markets are self-correcting, no problem. And then if anybody, most of the pundits and most of the housing economists you'll get to hear on TV will tell you, oh, it's because we overregulate the market and we make it too hard for people to produce housing. That's why we have a shortage of housing, right? Anyway,
Ezra Klein, abundance.
What's that?
Ezra Klein,
Ezra
or the
Klein,
whole
right.
book saying exactly
the whole
that.
abundance argument, right?
Yes.
And so, what people miss is the fact that right now in the U.S. and in the world, wealth and income inequality are as bad or worse than they were during the Gilded Age, which was the worst, right? And what happens when large amounts of wealth accumulate in places? Wealth runs around the world seeking yield. And where do they go to yield? They go to markets, investment markets that produce safe returns. And one of the safest returns in investment markets in the world is the U.S. real estate markets. So billions and billions of dollars have been crowding into the U.S. housing market. And in fact, that's why I predicted the great financial crisis that hit in 2008. We were predicting it in 1998 because I have been tracking flows of international capital into their housing market starting in the early 1990s. And it had gone from just a few billion, like 10, 20 billion to over 200 billion in a matter of 5 years. And it just kept growing, right? So nonetheless, right, we still have what we consider to be a perilously low supply of available and affordable houses, even though we have 15 million more houses than we need, right? And that's, one of the reasons for that is that we actually haven't been producing housing for a variety of reasons for more than a decade, actually for almost 3 decades. And we've lost a lot of the affordable housing units, right? So if you build housing, the primary way that we build affordable housing in the US is the low-income housing tax credit, which in my view is the worst housing program ever invented, but I'll explain that to you some other time. Those things, they have a clock on them, and they only remain affordable for a certain length of time. The original program was 15 years. In some places it goes to 25, some places it goes to 30. But now that program has been in existence since 1987. We lose more units every year. They fall out of the affordability requirements than we actually build. And what's even worse is that building housing in general in a given year, through obsolescence, through storms and destruction, and through just abandonment, we lose 1.5 million units of housing a year from our housing stock. And in a good year, we build about 1.2 to 1.4 million. So we've been losing ground for about 25 years, right? But the big thing is, and this is in red because, I need to alarm you, right? The mischief caused by outside money. And this is the thing about treating housing as a commodity, right? So in recent years, 20% of transactions in the single family housing market have been sold to institutional investors, right? This is mostly private equity or REITs, real estate investment trusts, right? And today, about 25% of the single family housing stock in the United States is owned by investors. Now, not all institutional investors, some are just, local landlords who buy 2 or 3 units to, whatever, for their retirement or but it doesn't matter because every unit that's taken off the market that would otherwise be available is now in the hands of somebody else, and it becomes in many cases, if it's held vacant as for speculative purposes, or if it's converted from being an owner-occupied unit to a rental unit, all it does is it continues to bid up housing prices and make less and less housing available, and it creates what we call artificial shortages, right? And the thing is that the activity of investors is not uniformly distributed, and this is a bad thing, right? Because the investors are buying up housing in the low income, moderate income, and minority census tracts. And there's a reason for that, and I'll go into that in a minute. And then there's manufactured housing, otherwise known as mobile homes. And if you don't know, the mobile homes are a gigantic part of the housing stock in the United States. There's about 8 million mobile homes in the United States. We call it manufactured housing since whatever, 1974 or something, but a lot of people still recognize them as manufactured mobile homes instead of manufactured housing. But about somewhere between 3 and 3.5 million of them are homes that people own, but where they rent the land underneath them in what we call manufactured housing communities or mobile home parks. And since 2015, about 30% of the pads in those manufactured housing communities have been bought up by institutional investors, private equity, and REITs, right? And that's about 7,000 communities, right? And about 30% of the stock. And what they usually do when they come in is they raise rents, they reduce the services, and they hope to displace people out of those parks so they can junk their units, put a new unit in there, and sell it to a new homeowner. And it's devastating for anybody who lives in a mobile home park to be displaced because you can't, they call them mobile homes, but they're not mobile. Once they've been placed, about 95+% of them never get moved. And there's no place to move them because you can't move a mobile home from one manufactured housing community to another because they don't take used manufactured housing units in other parks. So your only option is to go buy some land and move it onto your land. But if you're getting displaced from a manufactured housing community because you can't afford the rent, what's the likelihood you're going to be able to buy land, right? So anyway, so and this is we actually did, we funded a documentary on this. It's called The Decent Home. And we had Elizabeth Warren in it, as a matter of fact. And it showed the closure of a mobile home park in Aurora, Colorado, but also showed activity of investors in Iowa that have been doing lots of bad things to people in mobile home parks. But anyway, but all this has just been going on recently, right? So all this investment into manufactured housing started really about 2015, and all the investment in single family housing started right after the Great Financial Crisis, right? And it's a little bit of a mystery. Why did it take the Great Financial Crisis for that to happen? But as it turns out, it's one of those cases in which kind of necessity, spawned innovation, right? So what happened was, millions of people were losing their homes to foreclosure. But before that, the reason it didn't happen before the Great Financial Crisis is because everybody thought that trying to manage scattered site properties was a losing proposition. It was too expensive, right? And nobody had been able to think about what you could do if you got economies of scale, if you had enough units all kind of together, right? So starting about 2009, Blackstone started buying up non-performing mortgages from people like Fannie Mae, Freddie Mac, the big banks, right? And they're buying them in like bundles of 10,000. They'll buy 10,000 non-performing mortgages, which then gave them the ability to boot out 10,000 families who were going to lose their homes to foreclosure, or not boot them out and then rent the houses that they formerly owned back to them, right? They did it on the presumption that what they're going to do is they're going to wait for the housing market to recover, and then they're going to sell them. And I reviewed a bunch of these portfolios because I was in the market in those days working for the Ford Foundation, and their expectations were they're going to be producing a 30% annual return on investment on those in that. And the reason was because you could buy a mortgage, a non-performing mortgage would sell for about 35 cents on the dollar on the value of the mortgage. And then you own the house, and then you could rent it and get cash flow. But what happened was, so Blackstone was sitting on probably 50,000 homes at one point, and they realized the housing market wasn't going to recover as fast as they thought it would. And so they said, well, what are we going to do? Because we have all these investors who want their 30% ROIs. So they decided that they definitely had to rent them to create the cash flow. And if they rent them to create the cash flow, then they realized, well, maybe we should prop up a scattered site property manager. And they did, and it's called Invitation Homes. But what they realized was when they set up Invitation Homes, which is now the largest owner of single family homes in the United States, when they propped up Invitation Homes, they didn't have to sell them back onto the market because they were making money hand over fist, because now they had reduced the cost of doing property management, and they were able to jack up the rents, because I don't know if you remember, but when everybody got displaced from the owner-occupied market, they're all going to the rental market, and rents were going up at double-digit rates. And they've been going up at double-digit rates for many of the years since the Great Financial Crisis. So all of a sudden, right, these guys are making a shitload of money, right? And not only were they making that kind of money, but other people are saying, well, if Blackstone can do it, why don't I do it, right? And so before you know it, right, everybody who could put together kind of a stack of money was trying to figure out ways they could go into the housing market, buy up houses, and then convert them from owner occupancy to rental, right? And so just so you understand the economics, and I'm going to tell you this, but I want to warn you, I don't want you to use this as a business proposition. I'm
no
trusting that you guys have
We don't allow them.
have enough ethics and morality that you're not going to go out and try to displace people from the housing market, because it can be done, and it has been done, right? So it's just an interesting exercise, and I'll show you what I did. But so for every $500 of net income you get out of a property per month, and when you capitalize a cash flow, right? Basically, you divide it by what the cap rate is, and it tells you what the asset value is. It generates that cash flow, right? So in this case, so for every $500 of monthly rent, capitalized at a 6% cap rate, which is about, well, it's a little bit high actually for the going cap rate for rental properties. That translates to a $100,000 valuation, right? So in this example, right? So let's say you have a 3-bedroom home somewhere that rents for $2,000 a month, which is cheap now, right? And throws off $1,500 a month of rent, right? Because the 500 is property taxes and mowing the lawn, whatever, right? So that house is worth $300,000 on the market. And anybody investing, any investor in the housing market would take that investment. They would pay $300,000 for an investment that would generate $500 a month in perpetuity, right? So, and that doesn't even take into account that there's lots and lots of tax and accounting advantages for rental units that aren't available to owner occupants, and cap rates are actually closer to 5%. And then a 5% cap rate, that valuation goes up to $360,000. So, so this creates what I call the new single family economics. So all of a sudden now people are thinking, well, you know, maybe it's more advantageous to just own these homes and rent them out. And so why don't we just do that? And then some people say, why don't we build homes that we're just going to rent out as this whole single family rental market all of a sudden has boomed. And I don't know if you keep track of these things, but I do. And there's hundreds of thousands of new starter homes being built, but not for people to buy, for people to rent, right? And Phoenix is leading the nation in single family rentals. But the weird thing is where the capital is going, right? And it took me a minute to kind of try to figure out why that was. But as it turns out, we started mapping all the investor activity. And the investor activity wasn't going to the places you would think, right? It wasn't going to New York. It wasn't going to LA and San Francisco. It was actually going to the older industrial cities. It's going to Buffalo and Akron and you know, Allentown, Pennsylvania, and you know, all the other kinds of places where capital had been running away for the last 4 decades. Why is capital all of a sudden crowding in? And the reason is because in those places, the price of a house is low to buy and rents are high. And then even within places like in Miami, where not a lot of capital is crowding in, but where the capital is crowding in, where is it going? It's going to the minority and low income census tracts, because those are the places where the acquisition prices are relatively low, but rents are still high. And one of the things, if you know what we call price elasticity of demand, one of the things you find out is that demand for housing in the low end of the housing market is very price inelastic because people have no other place to go. So they get charged disproportionate rents to be at the low end of the market compared to the wealthy end of the market, where their price elasticity, there's more elasticity, and so there's more competition for owners and renters, right? So anyway, I was going to ask you to guess why, but I just told you, so sorry. Spoiler alert. This I got, my organization, we have an $800 million endowment, right? So we invest, right? So I get these investors, the investor sheets all the time, people trying to get us to invest with them. And so I got one of these from a REIT, to a real estate investment trust, and they're trying to get us to park, you know, a few $1 million with them so they could go out and buy homes that they would convert from owner occupancy to rent. And this is how they.
So you guys can be part of the problem.
With that,
you guys can be part of the problem.
Yeah, we could. Yeah, but I told my board, I'm not going to let you do it. It's not going to happen. Not when I'm on the president. So tough luck. But anyway, so they have like 3 categories of things, right, that lead to their decisions, right? One is the financial decisions, and the first is the price to rent ratio, right? That's the acquisition price to the rent to the market, right? The next is, you know, property taxes, state income taxes, are just economics of why people might want to live in that market. The next is just demographics. So are people moving in? Aren't people moving in? And the others are, these are the ones that kill me, right? Tenant laws. So where do they want to go? They want to go to places where tenants are less protected. Are they landlord friendly? If you look down this column, right, there's none of them that are renter friendly. Oh, there's one renter friendly, sorry. And some of them are balanced, but almost all of them are landlord friendly, meaning that you can do accelerated evictions, right? And then they do other things like, you know, flood risk, FEMA flood risk, and, you know, some things like whatever, others like winter, right? But look at where the money's going, right? Cleveland, Ohio is the #1 destination for investors who want to buy up houses. Now, I just left Cleveland. I was there yesterday, right? And in Cleveland, in a land bank, they have 12,000 homes that they still have in the land bank that were lost to foreclosure and tax foreclosure, that are just sitting there in Cleveland. And investors are still going and buying the existing housing stock and bidding up the prices, right? Birmingham, Alabama, Dayton, Ohio, Allentown, Pennsylvania, and look at Buffalo, New York, right? Now, Buffalo, New York was the most robust housing market in the United States for the last 2 years. Buffalo, right? Now, and what does it mean to be robust? It means that the price, the percentage increase in prices is the highest in Buffalo in all housing markets in the US. So how can the price of housing get pushed up so quickly in Buffalo? It's because of capital crowding in. They're not, it's not like there's a lot of population growth in Buffalo. And what are they, in fact, let's look. So where's Buffalo here? So Buffalo, it lost population, right? In both the city and the metro, right? In the last, since 2010, right? But the key is, of course, that there's easy prey in those places, and that's why investment is crowding in and is buying up the single family housing stock. So I did a little experiment, right? So what I did was I went to the data and I asked, I asked HUD, what is the median house price in this market for a 3-bedroom house, right? What's the median rent for a 3-bedroom apartment? Then I capitalized. I said, well, if we took a 15% management fee, and by the way, the management fee that Invitation Homes charges is less than 10%, right? And then I capitalized the cash flow. And so in Kingston, New York, which was the #1 housing market in the US during COVID, because if you know Kingston, it's like 90 miles north of New York City. And it's where all the people that were priced out of Brooklyn went, because it's kind of edgy and cool, right? So anyway, and the people in Kingston are pissed, right? Because these Brooklynites are screwing things up, right? So the capitalized value of the median house, right, you could buy for $359,000 is $400,000. So you would buy it as an investment, right? And then that day on Zillow, I went to Zillow. I said, how many houses are available on the market, 3 bedrooms or more, that are less than $400,000 in Kingston that day? There were 67. Now, Kingston, New York has 32,000 people in it, right? So 67 houses in Kingston, New York is a lot of housing, right? So then I went to Akron, Ohio, which was the #10 housing market in the year that I did last summer when I did this, right? And in Akron, the median house price is cheap. It's $206,000, and rent seems reasonable for a 3-bedroom apartment at $1,389 a month, right? That capitalized to $236,000. Once again, more than the median price, right? And I looked at the market in Akron, and Akron's not that big either, right? 284 houses for sale in Akron that day, right? On Zillow. Nuts. Buffalo, which of course was the #1 housing market in the US in 2025 and 2024, right? So in Buffalo, it's about the same. The median house price, $236. The capitalized value of renting is about for $238. 551 houses, right? So think about it. If you want to concentrate your money so that you could get the economies of scale of managing a bunch of properties locally, don't do it. But I'm telling you, if you wanted to do it, this is why you would do it. You could buy 550 homes in Buffalo just in that one day, right? Allentown, Pennsylvania. Now, the funny thing about Allentown is the capitalized value of that rental market was slightly lower than the median house price, but only by about $800. But there were still 224 homes available in Allentown that day. And Allentown's not that big. I don't know how big it is, but it's 100,000 people, maybe.
Used to be probably less than that now.
All right, so we're a land policy institute. What do? We make policies. We propose policies. We tell people what they do. So we have a bunch of ideas of what people can do to defend their housing stock from the invasion of investors, right? This is what Veblen would like us to do, right? This is managed capitalism, right? So what I suggest is there's 3 things you can do. You can actually physically insulate a share of your housing stock by just pulling it off the speculative market. And I talked to you about how you do that in a minute. Or you change the economics, right? By changing the tax policy and stuff, so you make it less economically beneficial for people to do this stuff, right? Or you build more housing and primarily on public land. And one of the things we've been doing for cities has been mapping out all the public land they have. And as it turns out, there's a shitload of public land out there available and good for supporting affordable housing that for one reason or another, and it's almost all owned by local governments, cities and counties, that they don't want to use. And the reason they don't want to use it is because there's no incentive for like a local official to kind of dedicate public land for public purpose. Because, any piece of publicly owned land in any place, there's about as many opinions as how it should be used as there are people, right? So, so it's risky, so they don't do anything, and they sit on it. And this land has been, you know, they've been sitting on this land for decades in most cases, right? And a lot of places they don't even know what they own. It's really crazy. But anyway, in fact, one of the people I was with in Cleveland yesterday, the Port of Cincinnati decided that they were getting all these complaints, and in Ohio, I don't know if you know about this, but in Ohio, they have, I think it's 91 port authorities. But they have 2 ports. They have the only 2 ports are Cleveland and Toledo, right? Cincinnati has a port authority, but it doesn't have a port. It's on a river, right? But and the reason is, and this is one of those funny things about, you know, policy, the enabling legislation that they use to create ports is also perfect enabling legislation for creating a redevelopment authority. So rather than actually just create one for redevelopment authorities, they just use the port designation. And so they have a port in Akron. They have a port. I mean, they have a port in Columbus, right? I mean, they have ports all over the place, right? Some places don't have water, right? So anyway, the Port of Cincinnati decided that it was going to get out in front of the investors, and it was going to do what the private capitalists are already doing. It's going to buy the homes. It's going to manage them, generate cash flow, and hopefully then turn them over to people to buy. And the reason they did it was because they're getting all these complaints from people in the neighborhoods, because they're saying these absentee landlords are coming in and they're stripping out all the landscaping because it reduces the cost of managing the property. And they're screwing up our neighborhoods, and then they're parking on the lawns. And you know, one of the things that homeowners always do is they hate renters, because renters are others, right? But in this case, some of it was true, and they were actually documenting like code violations and stuff. And they were saying, what can you do? And the city turned to the port as a redevelopment authority. They said, what can you do? And so they got out ahead of these private equity buyers. They bought a couple hundred homes, what they call their CARE, 194 homes in their CARE Homes Initiative, to see how it will work. And so now they own the homes. They've been fixing them up. They've been selling some of them. They've been managing them as rentals. And now they're thinking about propping up their own property management division and starting to do, instead of the private equity people or the REITs, buying up homes and managing on behalf of the citizens of Cincinnati, right? And we were talking about that in Cleveland, because we're saying, hey, we had the Port of Cleveland there too, right? Hey, there's an idea. Why don't you do that, right? If Cleveland's top of the list here, buddy, you better worry about it, right? And they're thinking about what they could do and using their balance sheet to kind of go buy the houses, right? But the other thing you can do to pull housing off of the speculative market, you can commit it to being permanently affordable through things like community land trust. Now, how many people know what a community land trust is here? Not many. Wow. So community land trust, what you do is you sever the land from the improvements. The improvements are the buildings, and you hold the land itself in trust. And that trust is set up usually as a nonprofit. It's populated. Its board has members of the community on it, so they can decide, you know, how to manage it. And then you only sell the improvements. You sell the buildings. Now, as it turns out, as I told you before, the buildings actually aren't the things that appreciate in a property market, and so they maintain affordability over time because the buildings don't really appreciate, and then they charge kind of a nominal rent for the land for the people who live on the community land trust. And so we started community land trusts in the U.S. back in the 1960s. When I was at Ford, we invested in kind of creating a whole kind of national community land trust movement. We have about 330 community land trusts around the country now. There's a bunch in Pennsylvania. I don't know, I guess there's none around here, but but right now it's still relatively small. There's only like maybe, I don't know, somewhere between 30 and 50,000 housing units in community land trusts. But the key is that they're not available for private investors to come in and buy them up. And then the community land trust becomes kind of a self-care kind of organization, what Polanyi would call kind of the dual movement of people trying to find their way back in and protect themselves from the economy that's treating things as commodities that shouldn't be commodities, right? And so that's a good thing, right? But there's other things, right? So right now, localities can do what you call inclusionary zoning requirements, so that anybody that builds housing is required to build housing that is offered inexpensively in the market. And the way you keep it affordable is you put what you call a deed restriction on it. So you say that it has to remain affordable in perpetuity. And the way you make that happen is usually you put some subsidy into the units. So in the US, there's somewhere between 1 and 2 million inclusionary units now that are protected with deed restrictions. And then, of course, there's all the subsidized housing. I told you about the low-income housing tax credit. There's a bunch. There's public housing, and there's Section 8, place-based Section 8. There's low-income housing tax credit, and all of those are maintained at least for a medium to long term as affordable, right? And they're not available for people to buy and take them off the market. So that's one market intervention where you actually just insulate your housing market. But the other is that you actually start doing your job, right? As a public sector, right? You create a rental registry where anybody who wants to rent a property has to register with the city. And then they have to tell you things like, what are you charging? And they also have to be available for inspection to make sure you're not exposing people to unsafe and unsound conditions, right? And it's really, it kills me to say it, but like in our estimation, fewer than 10% of jurisdictions in the United States have rental registries. So nobody has even eyes on their own housing stock. They don't know what's going on, right? Then there's a thing that you call the right of first refusal, where the public sector can say, if any property goes up for sale, we reserve the right to buy it ourselves at that price. And so then they can at least know when speculators are showing up and trying to buy up the housing stock, right? You curtail short-term rentals, Airbnb and Vrbo and all those. Which, by the way, I don't understand why the hotel industry doesn't mobilize against short-term rentals, because the whole hotel industry has to live with regulations, hotel taxes, all the other things. Why aren't they charging the same things to Airbnb and Vrbo? It doesn't make any sense. But the other thing is to do aggressive code enforcement, because if these landlords are bad landlords, then they're not maintaining the properties, and you should be able to catch them with bad properties, right? Or you set standards like in New York rent stabilization, and you impose safety and soundness requirements. And then I gave a talk in New York, and a couple of state legislators were there. They went back, and the governor of New York supported legislation that they created a 75-day exclusion period that investors could not bid on the house for the first 75 days it was on the market, to give families a fair shot at buying a house, right? And then there's tax policy solutions. I won't go through all of them, but the main one, we're considered the global authority on the property tax. And my assertion is that if you own 10 units of housing in a market, you're no longer a residential owner, you're a commercial owner. And you should be paying the commercial property tax rate, which is typically 2 or 3 times higher than the residential rates, right? Anyway, and by the way, if you guys want this, I'll give you this deck, and so you can be bored again. But and then the public lands. This is kind of an interesting thing, because so the White House, not this White House, the good White House that we used to have, contacted us, and
This one is, I was thinking, we have a president that is a slumlord.
Yeah, and he's also trying to impose restrictions on private equity from getting into the market, but it's not going to work, right? But anyway, so they expected to get reelected, right? And so they came to us. They said, we want to create our next national housing policy, and they said, what's the best opportunity for us to address the affordable housing crisis? And I said, build housing on public land, right? So they said, okay, can you find the land? Where would we build it? So we have a thing called the Center for Geospatial Solutions, which is a big GIS operation. And so we built this thing called Who Owns America, which is a parcel level database that has every single parcel of land in the United States in it. 150 million parcels of land in the United States, if you want to know. And then what we said was, we're going to look at only urban parcels that are accessible to transit, and accessible means within 1/4 mile of an active transit line, that had a vacant parcel, at least a half an acre, and was not in a right of way, not in a public park, not in wetland, right? We excluded all that. And we found that in the US, there were 276,000 acres of publicly owned land that met those criteria. And we told the White House that if you built them at very low densities, you could build about 1.7 million units of housing on that. And if you went to reasonable medium densities, you could build about 4 million. And if you went to high density, you could build about 7. But and then they asked, well, who owns it? And as it turns out, of that 276,000 acres, 237,000 of them are owned by local governments. So this is all right in the hands of the local government. They could actually work, with a public-private partnership and produce housing on their own land. And they make all the rules and they can decide whether it's affordable or not. They can really kind of, and when we advise the local governments, you say, don't sell the land, lease it so you can have eyes on it and you can really control its destiny, right? But then I asked I asked my quants to relax the transit accessibility restriction. And this stunned me. There's 4.6 million acres of urban publicly owned land in the United States. Not transit accessible, but the thing about transit accessibility is if it's not transit accessible now, it could be. All you gotta do is build a bus line or a light rail, right? So, and of that, half of it, about 2.3 million acres of public land is available, which could support what? 34 million units of housing. And by the way, you know what the housing shortage is in the United States for affordable housing? The estimates, and they range, right? So the National Low Income Housing Coalition says it's 7 million. Right? And I don't know, the National Association of Home Builders actually goes lower. They say it's like 3, right? But it's not 34. Right? So you could build a lot, right? Anyway, so and then my question is, if the economics of single family housing, they're working so well for the private sector, why does it work for the civic sector? Why doesn't it work for the nonprofits and stuff? Especially because they don't have hurdle rates of 30% that they need to give to their investors. Why can't they just do the same thing? Turns out they're just slow. They just didn't get the memo, and now they're just kind of figuring it out. And so there's a couple of efforts. One is this Homes for the Future Fund that a group called Grounded Solutions Network has, where they're actually trying to buy up, do exactly the same thing, manage these properties, and then their exit strategy is to put them into community land trusts, right? Mm-hmm. And then there's this other thing called mixed income neighborhood trusts, which actually go in and they buy the land in neighborhoods, they put it into community control, and then they manage the properties, right? And in both cases, what they're doing is they're tying up the land, and they're able to control the housing there, right? All right, so you need to see this. So I just want to show you just a few pictures so you can understand what it means when private capital invades the market, right? So we were asked by a city councilor and a community organizer in Baltimore to look at what was going on in Baltimore, because they were saying that a lot of Baltimore is being bought up by private equity, right? So this is Baltimore, right? And just to tell you, so anything that's whitish is owner occupied, right? And anything that's not white, whether it's green, blue, red, or purple, are investor owned, right? So if you know Baltimore, one of the things you know about Baltimore is that Baltimore is surrounded by wealthy suburbs, right? That don't like to do their share of affordable housing, right? And they crowd all the affordable housing right into the center of the city. And that's where you see all the pink and purple and even a little bit of green, right? But what's even more interesting, if you zoom in, so this is Patterson Park, right? Now Patterson Park in Baltimore is basically Central Park for Baltimore. It's not quite as big as Central Park, but it's big, right? And if you look at Patterson Park, you'll notice it's mostly white around Patterson Park, and it's mostly white too. White people live there.
Gentrified.
Right? But you go just north of Patterson Park, where Johns Hopkins is, and look at this, right? It's all purple and red and blue, right? Because the investors have gone there, and then you go to the other side of Baltimore, where these are the minority census tracts in Baltimore, and that's where the investment's going. So all right, so that's Patterson Park, and when you zoom in, you see Patterson Park is once again almost all owner occupied. And then we look at Hopkins, and you go in closer and you see, and this is the density, right? And some of these blocks, 70% of the housing now is owned by outside investors, right? And these are row houses. These are the houses that the working class used to live in when they worked in the port in Baltimore and stuff, right? And so then we asked some other questions because, that's what we do. We ask questions, right? So we looked at all the properties that sold since 2021, and anything that's bluish were bought by owner occupants, and anything that is reddish are bought by investors, right? And look at where the owner occupants are buying, right? This is the Inner Harbor, which is the affluent area of Baltimore. This is Patterson Park, and almost all the rest of the city is being bought up by investors, right? And then we mapped permit and code violations. And I want to just flash back and forth a little bit. So look at where look at where the investment, look at where the investment's going, where the pinkish stuff is. Look at where the code violations are. And it tells you a little bit about the behavior of these landlords. They're not typically nice people. Not all landlords are bad people, by the way, but most of them are. So the next thing we did was we mapped vacant properties, right? And there's a lot of vacant properties in Baltimore. There's like a 9,000 in their land bank, right? But of the vacant properties in Baltimore, an extraordinary amount of them are owned by investors. And they're still vacant. Every pink one of that, the blue ones are owned by private owners, individuals, but the rest of them are owned by investors. And they're speculating on these properties. A lot of them are buying them on the internet. And they're just sitting on them, doing nothing, right? Naked speculation, just waiting for the property values to come up. And then, just for grins and giggles, right? We said, what if we looked at the change in ownership patterns by council district? And so every one of these charts is a council district. And the way to read this is the dotted line that goes across here is no change, right? And the color of what's above or below the line is the nature of the housing, right? So the gray ones are owner occupancy, right? So anything below the line means it's a decline in owner occupancy. Anything above the line here is an increase in owner occupancy, right? Well, guess where that neighborhood is? Patterson Park. Guess where that neighborhood is? Inner Harbor, right? So, and then you see, anything above the line is an increase, right? So the red is an increase in investors that are in state that own a portfolio of properties that are at least 25 properties, right? And the purples are out of state investors. The light purple is just few properties, and the deep purple is the large inventory property owners, right? So we bring this to the city council, and the community organizer brought a bunch of people to the city council meeting, and they disrupted the meeting because the people in the city came to the city council meeting and they started screaming at their city councilors about like District 9. They said, we've had a 4% decrease in owner occupancy, and we've had a gigantic increase in investor ownership, right? This isn't what are you doing to protect our neighborhoods? And you know what the city council did? They censured the city councilor that was working with us. and they kicked everybody out of the meeting. So
That's public policy.
Yeah, it's public policy at its best, right? So anyway, that's the story. But the story is that there are now efforts around the country where they're trying to find ways to get in front of investors and protect our housing stock. But the thing is, and why do we care, right? Why do we care about whether or not you take a single family home and you convert it from owner occupancy to rental? Well, if you don't know, Americans still hold the bulk of their wealth in real estate. The average American family has almost 80% of its net worth tied up in their house. And if we want to close racial wealth gaps, if we want to close, any kind of wealth gaps, right? The primary way we've done it in the United States is through homeownership. And now we're just cutting off that channel because we're taking more and more units that would be available, starter homes, and we're letting them kind of leak off the market. And one of the reasons they made that 75-day moratorium in New York is because in New York, that quarter that I was there, we estimated that almost a third of transactions in the single family housing market were cash only. Now, how many first-time home buyers you think of buying homes with cash? Right? I just happen to be walking around with $280,000 in my pocket. Let's buy a house, right? So, and these cash buyers very often are quick execution. They don't even bother with an inspection. They price it on the web, right? And they're buying these things up, and there's no way for an individual who has to get financing and stuff to get out in front of that. So the answer in New York was give families a fair shot, and they thought 75 days was enough. In Washington, they're now trying to limit the total number of houses an individual investor can buy to 25 in the entire state, right? Now that seems reasonable, except one of the things we found out, what we did was we merged our property data with open corporate data because we were trying to figure out like where is the money coming from, and we actually had to pierce like 4 corporate veils sometimes to figure out the owner of record versus the provider of the capital. So you know, there's people that we buy ugly homes. They don't, those people aren't buying ugly homes. They're just agents for the capital that flows through them, right? And they just get a transaction fee if they find someone to sell a home for cash, right? And there's a lot of people like that. And so lots of these large scale investors, they set up individual property managers, sometimes at the city level, sometimes at the state level. And then you find your way up to Blackstone, right? But it's like 3 or 4 removes, right? So how is someone going to know whether someone owns more than 25 units of housing if they buy it under 7 different guises, right?
Yeah.
So anyway, it's difficult to enforce, and it's particularly difficult to enforce if you don't have eyes on your own housing stock. I wonder, does Lewisburg have a rental registry? Be interesting. College towns tend to,
I
right?
can answer that.
Yeah.
Yes, Buffalo has just started one. All rental owners just got letters this week.
In Buffalo, New York?
East Buffalo
Our
County.
township.
That's where it is.
Yeah,
Okay.
that's right.
Yeah,
No.
so they have not had one in the past.
Oh, so now they're doing
They're
it.
starting a registry,
Oh, well, that's good.
so
Yeah.
latest news.
But yeah, I wasn't trying to depress you, by the way. I mean, I don't know if you are depressed, but I'm happy to answer questions.
Yeah, so I know with homeownership and things like that, as property appreciates, you get better property taxes and better education. So when investors come to these low-income communities that buy these homes, does that actually help the education system or like access to opportunities within those like areas at all?
Well, yeah, to some extent, because so if capital floods in and they bid up property values, right? Then you have a bigger tax base to tax, and that will throw off revenue for the schools, right? But what generally happens, and this is what's going on now, as the property values get driven up, you get these kind of spontaneous taxpayer revolts because they're buckling under the weight of paying their property taxes. And what do? They go to the state and they say, we want to do away with the property tax. We have 6 states right now that are contemplating doing away with the property tax. And if they do away with the property tax, they're screwed, right? Florida is one of them, right? So Florida, we estimated that Florida, and they think that they don't have an income tax in Florida already. So they're going to do away with the property tax and they're going to replace it with the sales tax. And so we actually ran a simulation and we said in some of the counties of Florida, they'd have to make their sales tax 38% to replace the revenue that they were getting from the property tax.
Like a one-time sales tax?
No, forever sales tax because
Everything you buy, tax
38%
8% on top.
I'm saying like, so they're booking a sales tax like for a one-time.
that's what they would have to do if they're going to replace the revenue that they lost from the property tax, right? And we have, so there's 6 states that are contemplating doing away with the property tax altogether. And there's multiple other states where they're having these spontaneous taxpayer revolts, asking to do limitations on rates, limitations on assessment amounts and all that to give relief to the taxpayers. So that happens, then they cap the value of the property and it doesn't matter what investor, who owns it, right? And then it always redounds to bad things for the schools when they do limitations to the property tax. Yeah.
I assume California back in the 70s.
Oh yeah, Prop 13.
Yeah, Prop 13 is
It
the
ruined the
example,
schools.
but-
Yeah.
Question on public lands,
Uh-huh.
like I'm thinking about like BLM, US Forest, National Park Services.
Yeah.
I know that's probably, you're not talking.
We're not counting that.
You're
Yeah.
not counting that, right?
Yeah.
But still, like, what type of public land are we talking about insofar as like, is that gonna decrease accessibility in these public places? Or,
So-
because you're putting property on top of them, and then kind of paired with that, if we don't have the shorting, like, we have enough units, they're just not affordable, wouldn't it be better to just reclaim the units from the investors than to take away the public access to the people?
Well, that was strategy number 1, reclaim the units, right? But so,
Political liability.
yeah, but remember, so we already screened out anything that was in a wetland, anything that was in a public park, anything that was a right of way, and these are all urban census tracts, right? But urban census tracts include suburbs, right? So yeah, and we're not proposing you build on all of them, and you don't need to, right? So yes, the answer is it could result in less accessibility, but that's why what we propose is to work with cities to do kind of a portfolio analysis of all their properties and figure out what's most suitable for affordable housing and what isn't. Like, surface level parking lots, not a great land use in urban settings, right? And that doesn't do anything for anybody except, it's impermeable for rainwater, so it actually adds to the flooding, right? So those kinds of places would be suitable, especially if they're in an area that's relatively densely developed, to put housing. And you don't, in most places, you need to use maybe 10 or 15% of your available land, and you'll already cure all the housing challenges, right? So you just have to build a political will, and then you have to have the willingness to actually go down the road of thinking about it, which is always a challenge for people these days. And then you have to come up with a plan, right? And we've been working with some jurisdictions to do just that. So yeah. Yeah.
I have a question, just in general, towards like the working class, it's just kind of like, where do they go? I know you mentioned that, what's it called? You can always like regulate, like, the private equity and limit like when they can buy the houses. But like wage increases and increases in unions, like even be a sufficient enough response for people to even get into like, buying homes or?
Yeah, well, I mean, yeah, I mean, the real answer is income, right? But I don't know how we regulate any market to produce more income for people, and wages have been stagnant in this country for the vast majority of the population, except for the leisure class, since 1970s, right, with deindustrialization and everything. And house prices and rents have been going up at multiples of median wage increases in most of the markets in the US. It's an income problem, right? But I don't know how you fix that without, unionization could help, right? Whatever, better, where it could really help is that if we went back to, an income tax system with marginal tax rates like we had in the 1950s. Our marginal tax rates are ridiculously low for the wealthy, right? And the reason that we have kind of the worst distributions of income and wealth in almost US history now is because of tax policy. So we got to fix that. And if we fix it and we find ways to redistribute it and take some of the cost burdens off of people for buying health insurance or housing or other things, yeah, things could be a lot better. But you got to find a political commitment to do that. And you think that's coming from this White House or this Congress?
In all fairness, the erosion of the tax base has been bipartisan and for a period of. They're worse. I'm not saying but it's been bipartisan to some extent, and it's been going on for 50 years, as you said.
And just maybe as a follow-up question, this is probably like outside the conversation that you had, but then is like the neoliberal period coming to an end, because I mean we have like Donald Trump and his like supposed like right-wing populist movement, and much of the wealth inequality that we've had has come primarily from that. So like or you didn't say it, but like deregulation from like the housing market, which led to the collapse of the great financial collapse. So I was wondering, like, do you see like there's a change of period now where there could possibly be better policy for more working class politics, or where do you?
Not yet. But I mean, there's always hope, right? And that's your generation's problem, not mine. Right? But I mean, unless you have an organized response to these trends, that I mean, why do we have a populace that actually votes against their own self-interest? Most of the people who voted this administration into office are actually harmed by the administration. They're economically harmed, right? Just like in Britain, most of the people who voted for Brexit were actually harmed by leaving the EU, right? So how do we combat false consciousness when the channels through which people get their information are so narrow that and they don't seek out multiple kinds of information channels. They're relying on one or two that generally are like echo chambers, right? So until you find a way to kind of break through that and begin to mount some kind of resistance, like the No Kings rallies are a good example of those kinds of things, right? But then you have to then vote people into office that are going to be visionary enough to start putting policies in place that are going to be remedial. And that's going to take a while, right? Or it's going to take a crisis, right? Because, the last time we had, it was actually not as bad as it is now, but the inequality was in the 1920s that led to the Great Depression. And the New Deal, in some ways, was just a public response to keep us from either going socialist or going fascist. And they found a middle road, and the middle road they found was mostly like buying off the general population with homeownership and other ways to kind of saddle them with debt so they become more subservient. That's what Bedlam would say. Anyway, so you know, we need something that will kind of mobilize people and crystallize some kind of effort that will stick. But one of the things that people your age don't appreciate, and I'm old enough to know, is that this whole swing that people call this, you know, right-wing populism, it started in 1964 when Barry Goldwater lost to Lyndon Johnson. And what the Republican Party did and what the right wing did was they did community organizing. They mobilized, they put their people on every board and commission locally. They put every local court, they packed every local government so that then over the course of 30, 40, 50 years, how did you get Kavanaugh on the Supreme Court? You know, troglodytes like Kavanaugh, how do they exist, right? They exist because they were put into place decades ago as a strategy to kind of really
Half the Supreme Court worked for, you know, the Reagan administration, Roberts, Alito, you know,
Right.
and the other half for the Bush administration. So it's
Yeah.
they
I
give
mean,
lawyers
this is
the
going on.
Federalists.
So, you know, the left always considers itself the community representatives, the community organizers and stuff. We've been getting our asses kicked for 60 years, right? So maybe it's time to really figure it out. How do we mobilize as opposed to watching kind of the world be swept out from under us, right? And every one of those deregulations, by the way, and Matthias is right, Bill Clinton was responsible for the great financial crisis because he deregulated. He broke the firewalls between insurance companies and banks and everybody else. And he made it possible for contagion to spread across capital markets in a matter of 3 years or 4 years, right?
And if you look at the loss of manufacturing jobs that, you know, you were
Yeah.
talking there behind, the vast majority wasn't NAFTA. It was actually China, and he's the one that said, you know, if we open up and the WTO, and you know, it's going to have no impact, and 6 million jobs disappear.
But at what point do you get a spontaneous response? I mean, how many people have to be pushed out of their homes before people say, that, you know, Matt Desmond can write about it and everybody can, you know, be righteous and indignant about it, and then nothing will happen, right? And then at what point does something actually form as a meaningful response, or what Polanyi would call the double movement, where people actually start to try to bring public policy back into place to protect themselves from the economy that is out of control. I don't know. Yeah.
Yeah, I think in line with this, would we really say that the housing crisis is an income issue or a deregulation issue? I think it's a deregulation issue.
So when you say deregulation in the housing market, what are you talking about in terms?
Or like deregulation in general, so like.
Deregulation of financial markets, yes, right,
Exactly.
yeah.
Yeah, but I also think deregulation within the housing market, because allowing private equity to buy so many single family homes.
Oh, it wasn't
to
regulated.
Do it
Yeah.
with unethical business practices, like obviously property management is unethical. I think those things actually are more impactful than income, although income is very impactful, I would say. The housing market would probably be easier for people to access if there was more regulation.
But the thing is, they weren't deregulated. They were never really regulated.
Yeah.
Property management has never been that regulated. We could regulate it. We'd have to choose to do it, right? You know, there was nothing preventing anybody from buying real estate in the US from any place in the world, right? We could try to prevent it. And there's lots of countries in the world you can't go buy real estate in their countries if you're not a citizen, right? But we said, no, fine, come on, buy us up, right? So we have to be intentional and decide, yes, we're going to take actions, and for the right reasons, to make sure that we have shelter for our own people. What a concept, right? But and we need to then decide, if we're going to provide shelter for our own people, what's the best way to do it, right? We don't ask those kinds of questions because we don't have the intention of providing shelter for our own people. And then we blame the victims, right? We say, you know, bad choices led you to be homeless, right? Or the concentration of poverty led to the decline of the public housing system. Not that Reagan cut their capital budgets, right? So I mean, it's you know, there's the narratives that we layer over it are also really, really dangerous, and we let those narratives live, and they take on lives of their own.
Oh, talk about narratives. The number one thing that appears in textbooks of economics as bad regulation is house rent control.
Yeah, rent.
Yeah,
Rent control is the number one, even more than, you know, the minimum wage. So here you have a regulation that actually helps, is useful, and all textbooks, you know, say, oh, look at what terrible thing we're doing. So,
well, you can do rent control pretty badly too.
yeah, sure, fair enough, regulations can be botched. That's not.
So anyway, thank you for your time. Do you have another question?
Follow-up, you talked about false consciousness and people voting against their interests.
Yeah.
When they vote for Republicans, they're voting against their interests when they vote for Democrats too, if they're working class. Insofar as neoliberalism has been a bipartisan.
Well, that's
subject.
absolutely
I
right.
mean, Clinton was the tip of the spear of realization. And so I think it's just worth noting that insofar as now you have people like Trump advocating banning institutional investors from buying up things, looking like a friend of the working class.
Yeah.
And so I think we gotta be really nuanced in how we deal with this insofar as the bipartisan character of neoliberalism and the lack of a true alternative left in the United States.
But the problem is nuance runs counter to short attention